It's 10:15, time for another Moral Maze with Michael Buerk.
Good evening. They're clearing up tonight after yet another outbreak of racial violence. It's sweeping across the old northern mill towns with large ethnic minority communities and not enough jobs. Oldham, Bradford, now the poorer parts of Leeds. Young Asians, once amongst the least troublesome groups in our society, are now out on the streets firebombing cars, wrecking shops and brawling with white thugs set on provoking them. It's a rude awakening from the dream of an harmonious, multicultural Britain that celebrates its ethnic differences. Then it raises the difficult question of whether that is really the ideal we should be striving for. Is the alternative to multiculturalism really just intolerance? Should we be making more effort to assimilate those who come to live with us? If you join the great mass migrations to America, you were pretty well forced to become American and sign up to common American values and norms, and nobody then called it discrimination, rather the opposite. Does the new rhetoric of multiculturalism, even though motivated by tolerance and respect, actually encourage people to be racist? Is it turning Britain into a tribal society and eroding the sense of particularly English identity and some of the positive values we like to think that it stands for? Multiculturalism, then, good or bad? Moral Maze. Tonight, our panel, David Starkey, Dr. David Starkey, the Teledon from Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, Professor Ian Hargreaves, the editor-turned-teacher, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, and Dr. David Cook, the medical ethicist from Green College, Oxford. Ian, what to you is the important point here?
Well, I don't have any doubt that multiculturalism is a good idea, a sound idea. The simple proof of it is that it has no opposite. What could it be? Monoculturalism? Who lives in one of those? Biculturalism? Unimaginable. We all live within multiple cultures which reflect the tension between our pasts and our traditions on the one hand and our interaction with change in other people on the other. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge each other's cultural preferences, but we shouldn't do so on trivial grounds. Why should anyone object to another's food or clothes or desire to speak a language? But if people in Britain want to practice forced marriage or female circumcision, they must answer to the law and expect to be resisted. Democracy is by definition multicultural.
David Starkey.
I'm not sure democracy is multicultural at all. My problems with multiculturalism are from the perspective of a radical secularist and a radical libertarian. My sense is that liberty is essentially to be found in relatively homogeneous societies, either ones that are historically homogeneous or are homogenized by the processes of the Enlightenment. On the contrary, societies in which particular groups or religions are privileged tend to be highly absolutist societies. I fear that multiculturalism could actually be opening the way to a much more interventionist state, and that I deeply dislike.
Claire Fox.
I don't like the false polarisation between multiculturalism and assimilation, as though you've got to choose one or the other, because I actually think that they've got something in common, which is that they both stress difference. Either with the assimilationists, it's they need to become like us, as though they and us are essentially different, or that we're all culturally different, but we'll celebrate it. But they all stress difference rather than pointing out what we have in common and ignoring what binds us. So they both undermine universalism and push particularism, and I don't like that, and I actually think that's what's dangerous.
David Cook.
When I think of the Angles, Jutes, Saxons, Romans, Normans, Celts, I think we've always been multicultural and always been multiracial. The question then is, how are we going to respond to that reality, but also the reality of prejudice, especially when it's linked to power, the reality of discrimination and the inequalities of education, housing and employment. And then to ask the question, well, to what extent should government have a responsibility not just to try to end inequality, but to educate, or indeed positively to create some kind of ideal society?
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Samir Shah, who's chairman of the Runnymede Trust, which is an independently funded organisation that deals with lots of these matters, sometimes controversially. Samir, do you accept that there is such a thing, a basic thing, as a British, or let's refocus that down to English because it's a bit simpler, let's say English, host culture, so to speak? Is it helpful to think in those terms even?
I think there are obviously certain elements you can attach to the English society as a whole, but on the whole I don't think host culture is a terribly helpful term because it covers up far too many differences within English society itself. I think to respond to the earlier proposition about multiculturalism, I think there's enormous value in cultural diversity. First of all, it's a fact of life. We are a culturally diverse society. And secondly, we're going to get more so as globalization continues apace. We're going to get increasingly diverse, and subject to some general universal principles. I think it's on the whole a good thing. It's a good thing for a number of reasons. Let me just say two. First of all, I think it increases choices. It offers, and therefore it's good from a libertarian point of view. It increases liberty. And secondly, I think it enriches the pool of talent from which society can draw.
David Starkey,
Can we just be quite clear that I'm in no way arguing against diversity, or indeed cultural diversity? The question is how we cope with it. Because it is clear, isn't it, that there are two relatively different ways of coping with it. If we look, for example, at the last census sought to get people to identify themselves as British Chinese or British Asian or British black or just plain British miscellaneous white. Now, doesn't that suggest that we're wanting people to cease to think of themselves as individuals and to become part of quasi-ethnically defined groups?
Well, I think we are both, aren't we? We are individuals and we do belong to different groups at different times. We can be Londoners, I'm a Londoner, I'm also come from Indian extraction, I'm British, I support England today against Greece. I may not support England when they're playing India. I think there are all sorts of different things.
But the question then becomes, how far are these groups legally privileged, doesn't it? How far would you suggest that multiculturalism is actually going in the direction of giving legal privilege when you start saying that so many percentage of the police force must come from particular ethnic groups?
Well, I think
forgive me, isn't one there getting to the point that one is actually privileging a group?
I don't think so. I think, first of all, if multiculturalism is a kind of cultural free-for-all where everybody can do what they like and claim it's their culture, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's the right way. I think the issue that you're raising is about how to ensure representation in different institutions and organizations in this country so that they reflect the population from which it is drawn.
But doesn't that, forgive me, ensuring that, may not that in individual cases result in considerable injustice, i.e. two fairly equally qualified candidates? One of them may be privileged because they are black or because they're Asian. That's what I mean by group privilege.
Yes, I don't think it's actually legal.
Argument,
I don't think it's allowed to do that. I think what you're talking about are quotas, and I don't think that is actually legal. I think there is a desire.
Are we not moving there? I mean, for example, can I put it to you? What would have happened if Greg Dyke had said, for example, that the BBC was hideously black? Are we not actually moving in that direction of privileging?
Well, I think if the BBC of its 25,000 people was 23,800 black in this society, I think you might find that Greg might have made such a remark, and there may be something in it. As it happens, it's the other way around. Although I don't think Greg himself.
Rather like the rest of the population.
Well, it is proportional, but not across the whole management tree.
Fine. Can I then ask you another little set of very simple questions? Now, if we look at this different ways of dealing with diversity, let's look at one or two test cases against your principle of, I would argue, privileging groups, and my principle of reducing things to matters of individuals. Let's look at the law of blasphemy. Now, what would you favour doing with the law of blasphemy? Would you favour abolishing it? Or would you favour extending its protection to all religious groups?
I think whilst this society holds on to a law of blasphemy, I think you should treat all religions equally.
So you would extend it to all religious groups, thank you. What would you do with religious schools? Would you have every religious group entitled now to emulate the Church of England and the Jews?
I think
so that we have Muslim schools, we have Rastafarian schools, we have Confucian schools.
I think the principles of equality is what should pertain here.
So what does the principle of equality dictate? Does it dictate that we have every one of these different religions with its separate school system?
Well, it rather depends on how
I would like a very simple answer to a very simple question.
My simple answer is that the principle of equality should pertain, and if there are religious schools for one religion, then a principle of equality should suggest there should be equal rights for other religions.
And would you therefore deny that multiculturalism entrenches group differences and tribalism?
Well, are you in favour of Christian schools?
No.
You're not. So,
Passionately against. And I would suggest to you...
But then we both have equally logical positions.
We do, but yours happens to be one, as I began at the beginning by saying, that entrenches group difference. Mine is one that
I'm saying
reduces them to
something slightly
individuals.
different. I'm saying if we live in a society where Christian schools are allowed, then the principles of equality pertain.
David, I'm going to have to move on. Careful.
Well, trying to untangle multiculturalism is quite interesting. Do you think it's often associated with anti-racism? But do you think there is a danger that it apes the actual racial thinking, which categorises people, in this instance by cultural difference, instead of by racial difference as in the past? Is there not a danger there?
The danger being that...
Well, you identify people with their cultural identity rather than their racial identity. Why do they have to have some tag attached to them?
But we all do have identities. What are you looking for? People aren't blank pieces of paper. We all do exist in society, in cultures. I mean, I have a particular identity.
Right.
I mean,
you gave me lots of examples of your where you said I'm a Londoner and I'm this and I'm that. Yes. So none of those things then are particularly strong to you, or are they
fluid.
all? They're fluid.
They're fluid, of course.
So why
you are presumably a number of different things.
I'm trying to understand why you think that multiculturalism as a political way of doing things or as accepting things is very useful. I mean, if we're all lots of things, surely we're all the same. Why stress difference?
I'm not sure I even understand that statement. I mean, I think, as
well,
I
we
said,
all
I
are
think
human,
cultural,
and we're all.
Of course, and I said
my
definition was that cultural diversity is a good thing, and that within the constraints of certain universal human rights, we should allow people to live their cultures. And in fact, it offers us lots of different choices and gives us different talents and different abilities and skills. I don't see the problem with it.
It's just.
Sorry, go on.
Well, it's given a very important political status of being anti-racism. If you don't actually go along with the idea that we all must live and be defined by our different cultural experience, then we're told that we're not playing the anti-racist game. That was my question.
Well, it depends what the proposition against multiculturalism is, and then we can decide whether or not that is anti-racist or not anti-racist.
David Cook.
I wonder if you'd help me just see, is there a problem with multiculturalism? If we say it's a fact, it's a reality, what exactly is the problem? What's the premise of the difficulty?
I think the question is the extent to which, as I said, I don't agree that multiculturalism does not mean that it's a cultural free-for-all. And I think lines do have to be drawn about what is acceptable in a society, and if it's against particular cultures, there have to be yardsticks. And my yardsticks
are... interrupt you. What are your yardsticks?
Well, I think
because we were talking in theory. I mean, for instance, if somebody comes here from the Asian subcontinent, should they be encouraged to speak English, for instance?
Well, I think, why not? They should be encouraged to speak. I mean, we're coming to England.
Or do we get to a situation where we would want to preserve an immigrant community's capacity to speak, for the sake of example, Bangladesh?
I'm going to be really boring. I think it should be both. I mean, I think obviously you live in this country, you should be able to speak English, but there's nothing wrong with being able to speak Bangladeshi as well.
Sorry,
Bengali, as it would be.
Something seriously wrong with preventing people.
Oh, no, I don't think anybody was suggesting that. David Cook,
I'm still trying to tease out the nature of the problem, though, whether or not the problem is inequality, whether the problem is racism, or whether the problem is multicultures.
I think the problem arises when, in terms of multiculturalism, when you have to draw a line or strike a balance between a culture's desire to express itself and when it runs up against other principles, and to strike that. And that will happen in a number of different
But if you're going to end up, then you have to have some sort of hierarchy of principles. So which is more important, the coherence of the community as a whole, or allowing the expression of a particular cultural norm?
Well, I agree. I think now you have to strike the balance. I would say that our first recourse is to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's our first position. So we have principles of no harm. So now that might have its implications. Ian mentioned earlier about marriages, and forced marriages do harm, and therefore they fall, even if they belong to a particular culture.
So for
the caste system in Hindu society treats people unequally, and that falls on the principles of equality of human beings. So there are places where cultural expressions may not fit with
for
higher...
you, the commonality is more important than the difference?
Those commonalities contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Ian, a quick question?
David Starkey suggested that somehow or other ethnic minority recruitment to the police was privileging privileging that ethnic minority. I mean, isn't that simply a way of having an effective police force which understands the population it's policing and can do it properly and effectively?
I think, I agree, although I'm slightly sceptical of the extent to which that would actually come about. We have, I think the idea that police forces and all organizations should reflect the community in which they serve is right, and how we get to that point, which is the business of trying to recruit Black and Asian members, is worth doing. Although I do recall that back in the 60s in America, when the first race riots happened, there was a tremendous attempt at recruiting Black people into the American police force, and it hasn't exactly made the police force particularly pleasant towards the Black community. So I think it's a good thing to do, but let's not assume that's the only answer.
Hard and rocky road, Sammy Shah. Thank you very much indeed. Next witness is Professor Stephen Bush, who's the former National Vice Chairman of the Campaign for an Independent Britain. He's on the line from Manchester now. Professor Bush, you are firmly for assimilation, for the concept of assimilation. Just tell me, why should people who come here from, let's say again, the Asian subcontinent, become just well-tanned Englishmen?
Anybody that comes into a country that already exists, as ours has done in England for 1,300 years, should implicitly accept the obligation to conform to the country.
As a basic courtesy, you think?
Absolutely.
But do you think that...
No,
sorry, go on.
Yes. Moreover, I'd like to say that a national society, which is what Britain is, and England a very large element of that, is primarily held together by bonds of familiarity and obligation. And if you break or dissipate either of those, then your society falls apart.
I understand. Just very briefly, is the concept of an Englishman in this particular case that specific anymore anyway?
Well, it is, and I think one of the things one notices from the previous conversation, it is as if we had lots of different peoples of different races and cultures in this country, all broadly of the same numerical preponderance. And I take the view that that is simply not the facts of the case. We'll see in the new census what the proportion of all the ethnic minorities is in Britain, but certainly as late as 1999, 2 years ago, the Statistical Office estimated that the largest single minority, Afro-Caribbeans, was no more than about 1.6% of the population. And I think this is an important point, if I may quickly say so, that people keep talking about the ethnic minorities as if it was a single sort of American situation with a very, very large Negro or Black population. Our minorities are just that, a group of minorities, none of which is particularly numerous, and many of which have very, very different aspirations and attitudes.
Professor Bush, you made your point. David Cook.
I wonder if you'd help me whether the 5 million Scots and the Celts who go with them from Northern Ireland and from Wales have to conform to this model of Englishness which you seem to have.
Well, as you will doubtless read in Linda Colley's excellent book on Britons, she makes the exact point that, in fact, Britishness is, to a considerable extent, an artificial construct. She puts it no earlier than 1837. I wouldn't actually quite agree with her there, but the plain fact of the matter is that Britishness exists, if you like, in a sense, over and above.
So what is Britishness? Can you try and give me a definition? What are the fundamentals?
No, I can't give you a definition. What I will do is give you something else, and you can work it out from there. In my view, the determinants of a national society are some or all of a common land, a common history, i.e. shared experience, a common language, common race, common institutions, and beliefs. Now, insofar as the English, the Scots, Northern Irish, and the Welsh share a considerable number of those 5 that I've read out, and they are clearly a successful society up to very recently, then they will continue. But if, in fact, they cease to share a sense of commonness in those matters, then they will no longer be a national society, and you can see this all over the world.
Yes, I just think it's very optimistic to think that the values that we have in our present culture, quite apart from the variety of cultures, are really common. I mean, for example, fair play used to be a mark of Englishness. Does that mean you're opposed to discrimination?
Oh, yes.
So,
but it depends what you mean by discrimination.
Well, do you think?
I mean, I'm in favor. No, let me just say this because I think it needs to be said. If, for example, you say there shall be no exclusively by legal definition all English or all white or all Scots societies, then equally in my view there should not exist by legal definition all black or all Asian societies or all Bangladeshi societies.
Right, but we live in the multi-variety, and is it or is it not the case that in terms of unemployment, in terms of housing, in terms of education, that people from certain cultures are doing less well?
Well, let me just say this. The whole talk about multiculturalism, in my view, is talk of an ideology. It is not a self-evident good or bad. It is an ideology like Marxism, which is to which it is closely related. Now, in point of fact, the culture we live in, and indeed your previous speaker sort of in a sense hinted at this, although went on to make a very odd remark, is overwhelmingly industrial and commercial. This is what the vast majority of people in this country and elsewhere in the Western world experience. And in fact, far from us having masses and masses of little cultures, I think the word culture is hugely overworked. I mean, people talk about culture meaning country dancing or food, but culture is industrial. That's what it is, primarily.
Ian Hargreaves?
It's more than industrial, isn't it, by your own...
it's more than that, yes.
Yeah,
but it's primarily that.
Let's not argue about that. But one of the points of definition that you yourself offered was language, a shared language. Let's talk about language and the English language.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say to those who wish to speak another language even though they live in Britain?
I say this, that if anybody wants to speak another language, that is their private affair, but it is not the affair of the state. So, for example, after the war, a very considerable number of Polish soldiers were given the option of going back to Poland or settling in England, and many of them came, well, all of them were given the option, and many chose to settle in England. And over the period of time, from 1946-47, many of them did, in fact, maintain their Polish connections and taught their children Polish and so on. And that was their private agreement to do that.
Well, okay, can we come to now, though, because these are these are contentious issues. What about the British citizen living in Bradford who wishes to be able to receive forms from the post office in an Indian language? And what about the person living in Wales whose first language is Welsh?
So far as Bradford is concerned, we're talking about a multitude of potential languages, and my answer is that the language of the country is English, and people will have to learn English. And
so no concession should be made to
not on language grounds,
to the state's responsibility to be intelligible to those citizens?
No, the obligation is entirely on the individual to equip himself to operate in our society.
How does that...
Now, so far, let me just finish. So far as Wales is concerned, because you asked about Wales, Welsh is a historic language in this country, with roots going back as far as English. And I have no objection to Welsh people who want to speak English and have their children taught speaking English. What I do object to in Wales is their insistence that English people speak Welsh in Wales. I'm opposed to that. That's compulsion.
Can I just ask you, Stephen, what do you think that somebody who lives in a sink estate in East London has in common with the Queen or a very rich person? What have they got in common?
Well, first of all, a Queen and a very rich person are quite different.
Okay, the rich person and the... Can we go for the rich person and the East London sink estate person?
I don't have any... I mean...
have they got anything in common?
I'm not sure I know any rich people to make a judgment about that, Mrs. Fox. But what I get your drift. My whole view about sink estates is that they are monuments to precisely the same societal engineering which multiculturalism in this country, and indeed other countries like the United States, is concerned with.
Well, Stephen, maybe you
They
haven't
are-
got my
they-
point, because I wanted
I
to
have
know.
got your
Well, can I
well,
just add,
all
to
right.
make my question clearer?
Yes.
I wanted to know why it was you were using ethnic division as the most important way that you understood difference.
No,
Surely
I didn't.
there are worlds of difference
I-
between the
indeed.
white person who lives on
Yes,
the
sure,
white
sure.
English person. I want to know what you think the white English
let me-
person on an estate
yeah,
has
you
got in
keep-
common
you've asked-
with somebody who runs a factory and is a multimillionaire.
Yes, I absolutely believe that one of the things that the poorest members of any nation which is self-conscious of itself, shares with other members of that nation, regardless of status, is that sense of belonging. And in fact, I do believe that for the vast majority of people, not for the London metropolitan society, but for the vast majority of what I would call the hard-working classes around the country, their country, their sense of nationality and belonging is the second most important thing in their life after their sense of family. That is what links the poor and the rich. But I'm not satisfied with that huge division that you point to, and I bend a lot of my activities to reducing that division.
Professor Bush, thank you very much indeed. Our last witness is Dr. Stephen Howe, who teaches politics at Ruskin College, Oxford, and is author of books like Afrocentrism, Mythical Pasts and Imagined Homes, and Ireland and Empire, but has particularly well worked out views on this business. You're against what you describe as institutional multiculturalism. In other words, you're against multiculturalism as some sort of political ideology or political policy. Is that the case?
In many of its forms, as they've been practiced in Britain and the United States, yes.
Why? What's wrong with it?
Well, let's unpack it for a moment, if we may. I mean, first, I guess I'd say, well, you know the old cliche, that's fine in principle, but it doesn't work in practice. A great deal of multicultural thinking is actually the opposite. It's unexceptionable, indeed utterly desirable in practice. As Ian Hargreaves said at the beginning, if the alternative is monoculturalism, then obviously one wants to be multiculturalist.
Sorry, may I take you to the point?
Okay.
Just give me two things that are wrong with it, in your view.
Let's be really sloganising then and say multiculturalism in some of its institutional forms is bad for women, and it's bad for equal educational opportunities.
Bad for equality,
Yeah.
in both senses. Ian Hargreaves.
You've hedged the statement about very carefully there, because you're not willing to make the generalisation that multiculturalism itself is the cause of inequality or the loss of appetite for equality.
No, certainly not, and that would be a rather silly thing to try
It would,
and argue,
yes, I agree.
actually.
Yeah.
Rather, I'd say that some kinds of multiculturalist attitudes and more policies end up with the wrong emphasis, emphasising diversity as an end in itself of policy. Diversity is a good thing, but a great deal of cultural diversity can look after itself in civil society. Basically, the problem is, and the reason why multiculturalist rhetoric at least is popular with many politicians, diversity is cheap. Really pursuing equality is expensive.
Yeah, but it's a diversionary argument, isn't it? I mean, you're wanting to label multiculturalism as the problem because it's not allowing you to talk about the kind of politics that you want to talk about, and we might be able to agree about that. But you're making a big charge here that multiculturalism itself is causing us to tolerate inequalities and injustices all over the place. Let's take women. You use the example of women. What you have in mind here, presumably, is forced marriage, female circumcision, treatment of women in some ethnic cultures and some religious cultures. Is that what you're on about?
I think you'd have to go a bit wider and say that there are some currents, some traditions of thought within all the major religions that will deny equality to women, certainly deny equal educational opportunity to women. And that's a core of the problem with religious schools, for instance.
But is the right approach to that? Let's take it away from the areas that we talked about with Samir Shah. Let's talk about Roman Catholicism and Roman Catholic schools. You presumably don't like what the Pope stands for on contraception and abortion, I imagine.
I would disagree. I believe in an individual's right to choose on such questions.
But what is your approach then to the existence of Roman Catholic cultures, Roman Catholic schools in Britain, that they should be made illegal, abolished?
No, of course not. I mean, there's part of me that has a sneaking regard for, the classic French Jacobin style. All education must be secular. But no, that could only be achieved basically by dictatorial means.
Exactly.
As long as one has genuine diversity of religious schools, as long as they're tightly monitored for standards, and as long as that's open to everybody.
And the perfect representation of the homogenous culture, as advocated by David Starkey in his introductory remarks, is North Korea.
David, the ball is with you.
And ignoring that rather silly remark, can we just take the thing back to questions of principle, which I've been trying to argue about? Would you agree with Michael Dummett that it is axiomatic that no state ought to take race, religion or language as essential to its identity?
Phrased like that, I can't agree or disagree in global terms. Race or religion, clearly no state which tries to found itself on that in ways that discriminate against racial or religious minorities could be democratically legitimate. Language is a bit trickier, isn't it, for reasons that have already been raised?
Well, indeed it is. I mean, we could see, for example, presumably you've now decided that Israel is not a legitimate state.
You really want to get into that
I
one?
do.
Can I give the 5-hour answer?
No, I'd like the yes. Michael tried to encourage you to be brief. I'd like the yes or no answer.
Well, I think that's...
Israel is a legitimate state in the sense of its being founded on primarily democratic principles, having UN recognition, etc.
But its citizenship goes purely to people whose mothers are Jews.
Well, not so, actually. It's a peculiar hybrid of having, on the one hand, an ethnic basis,
Germany,
on the other hand, equality of all citizens.
Can we just talk about Germany then? Germany, still, citizenship is directly linked to language, isn't it? If you actually look at the Wilhelmine laws that govern German citizenship, they're linked directly to language. Now, in other words, if you come from a German background, you are, by definition, entitled to German citizenship. Does that mean that Germany is not a legitimate state?
Again, it doesn't make Germany illegitimate full stop, but of course it means that I support those within Germany, including those in the present government in Germany, who are pushing to reform and universalise its citizenship laws, just as I support parallel movements in Israel.
Absolutely, or indeed in Britain. Why then wouldn't you come down much more clearly against sectarian education? Why won't you actually be honest and espouse those good, honest, radical Jacobin principles?
Because although, like you, I'm a radical secularist, I'm also, like you, a libertarian. I believe in individual choice, and that has to include parental...
Hang on a second, David, please.
Just a final question. The issue, surely, and where you have failed to identify the problem with multiculturalism, the problem with religion, is when the state starts backing it. In other words, when the state starts funding religious schools. If parents want to pay for themselves, fine. Shouldn't that be the point that you're making?
David Cook, your question.
No, I would like an answer.
No. Thank you. David Cook, your question.
I'm interested not in the discussion about states. What I'm interested in is your moral lines here. And it seems to me quite clear that what you're saying is in a multicultural society we ought not to tolerate everything, and we ought not to allow total freedom of groups, multicultural groups, to do their own thing. Is that correct?
Yes, if we specify that we can't or shouldn't allow groups to act in ways that discriminate within the group against some of their members, or restrict the freedoms of some of their members in ways that are inconsistent with wider democratic freedoms.
Even if the members are happy for that, even if that's the tradition and the culture, you are going to impose your set of Western liberal secular thinking regardless.
No.
Well, yes,
no,
I'm
that
thinking about the
doesn't
Roman
follow at
Catholics,
all.
for example, where they have an ideology which believes it is only possible for a man to be a priest. Now, if that's the case, then women inevitably are going to be discriminated against in one sense. There are many women who actually believe that, as well as men, and adopt that particular perspective. Are they going to be permitted not only to adopt the perspective, but to practice that?
Oh, of course, as long as membership of the Catholic Church is voluntary, as it is, and equally important, as long as there's total freedom to leave the Catholic Church for those who want to. This doesn't infringe liberal principles at all, does it?
So would it then operate exactly the same way for women and female circumcision, if the women are happy? Is that the route you want to go?
I think in that kind of case, we have to ask hard questions about if anyone really is happy with it. How have they been, let's use the crude word, brainwashed to convince them?
So you're going to
so.
brainwash them in a different way then?
If you have to put it like that, if it requires brainwashing to convince someone that being hideously physically mutilated is bad for them, then yeah, why not?
Claire Fox.
I want to talk about how, or ask you about how, whether you think that multiculturalism is in danger of naturalising difference and ghettoising people. Do you see a danger there?
Well, that is my core objection, or rather worry. And it's not an objection or worry, as Ian Hargreaves was suggesting, to multiculturalism in general, but to particular institutional forms. Yes, that it entrenches difference, and it can indeed entrench inequality, both between and, equally important, within groups.
Can you illustrate that? I mean, I was thinking of it in relation to the cultural sphere, and it was recently argued to me that the South Bank, in order to attract Asian kids, we wouldn't have Mozart, we'd have to have Asian music. But, I mean, is that the kind of thing you mean, or is it got more serious content?
Well, no, there's much more serious instances, aren't there, which you can see in any sharply divided society. I mean, the general problem here is one of separating politics and culture, which you can never wholly do, but I think you should strive to do so, if you like, to define politics fairly narrowly and strictly, and try and get away from the attitude that political ideologies or political programs somehow get extra legitimacy, or indeed only legitimate, if they can claim to carry a whole load of cultural baggage with them.
I'm going to just ask you on that political question. Are you arguing that it's the, you know, in some ways the political fight for equality is rather too difficult? People have retreated into the kind of cultural identity sphere. I mean, is that something you're concerned about as well?
Very much so, yes. I think that has happened as a widespread phenomenon, both of public policy, but also of a great deal of political argument. And it's bad news on the whole.
Dr. Howe, thanks very much indeed. So, panel, what have we made of what we've heard? David Starkey, you started off by saying that the democracy, or liberty, as you defined it, was mainly to be found, or most often to be found, in homogenous societies, and you had a great deal of fun luring Dr. Howe onto grounds of states that had requirements about either religion or language. What, to your mind, then, is the most appropriate ways to define a liberal democratic society? What are the yardsticks, in your view?
Well, we've precisely failed to do that for very obvious reasons. What we've been doing here is essentially criticising a phenomenon. It's been a critical debate. We've not been trying to put something in its place.
Though Professor Bush did try to, didn't he, David? He
tried.
did talk about common land, race, beliefs, history.
He tried, really, a kind of attitude to nationhood, which you would find, I shouldn't really mention these words, but a passionate Scottish, Welsh or Irish, or indeed Israeli nationalist. It's that particular attitude. Historically, England has tended to go down a very different route, in which we've tended to define Englishness, and indeed Britishness, certainly since the magic date of 1837, in terms of adherence to a particular set of free political institutions, like Parliament, like law, and so on. And those institutions, in a funny kind of way, have been absolutist. They haven't tolerated any kind of legally privileged group within society. And what really worried me, and I'm afraid my concerns were profoundly reinforced by Mr. Shah's comments, is that we are now starting to create legally privileged racial and religious groups, which will be entrenched by privileged schools, which will be entrenched by a law of blasphemy that will prevent criticism of them, in which all sorts of customs, which, as it were, the good acid of secular commercial society would normally dissolve, will be protected, and I loathe that.
So religious schools are an invention, are they, David? A new proposal in British politics and British public life?
They're a proposal that I would... They're not a new proposal, on the contrary.
They're a diminished fact.
They were, in fact, a rapidly diminishing element in British life until the Comprehensive Revolution, which gives them a spurious legitimacy because they offer some sort of decent education. I want to see them abolished. I am a Jacobin.
Okay, but isn't the...
And sorry, the difficulty becomes...
David,
becomes rather than just having Church of England and Catholics, when you have this multitude...
But the bottom line in all of this, and the really interesting difference in the argument here, was that Samir Shah said that on grounds of equality, cultural difference had to be respected. Your cultural difference is as entitled to respect as mine. That is a principle of equality. Stephen Howe tried to argue, but failed, that the very fact of that principle was itself undermining equality because it was distracting the attention of political reformers from causes of social justice. It doesn't seem to me that he managed to demonstrate at all cause and effect in that second proposition, which is why I don't think
Ian, what I don't understand is when that point is made, you have to respect my cultural difference to prove that you are into equality. Then you're basically saying that cultural difference is a thing which defines people, which is very close to a naturalised ethnic view of people.
Absolutely.
No.
And it actually says, this is the worst thing is, you are suddenly become a product of the accident of where you happen to be born and with what skin colour, and your race stamped all over you now in we
and you subsidise it and give it legal definition,
that is simply not true.
As if it's static, but it's actually it's dynamic.
And
it's constantly changing.
Also, the demand that culture be respected or reinforced and protected by institutional and indeed forces of the state is something which is done voluntarily.
But what is your culture?
The state isn't going to force that on anybody.
I mean, I actually asked, what is the cultural difference? And then it was, well, actually, I could be any one of things and I might change what I am. So either it is something and it's static, and the problem I've got is that Asian kids in Oldham or anywhere else are told that they are defined as Asian kids. And in truth, in France, the French far right will not accept Muslims into French society on the basis that Muslim cultural difference is so great from French cultural difference.
But if you want to reject that whole multicultural perspective, what have we been offered in its place? What we've been offered from Bush and from Howe was a compulsion, a prescription. A compulsion on the one side, well, English people should be forced to speak Welsh. Bangladeshis should not be allowed to do their own language. Then we had the prescription of a Western liberal perspective, which said, yes, we're going to brainwash in a different kind of way because our values are acceptable.
Exactly. So what is your answer, David Cook, when
try and get a moral maze on Saudi Arabian radio?
To avoid the tyranny of majorities wherever they arise.
And when there is a conflict, when a cultural difference, like cultural weapons in
then we
South
have to
Africa,
go back to an understanding.
like female genital mutilation, or like forced marriages, when there is a conflict of that kind, very briefly, David Cook, how is that resolved?
Then we go back to a basic understanding of what it means to be human, and we look at the fundamental values of doing harm. Not at all. I think it was interesting that there was a reference to human rights. I think it must go much wider than that, but I don't think we have any problem with
human enlightenment thinking. Human enlightenment thinking.
We defend our laws democratically arrived at and expect people to live within them and negotiate their differences with each other.
Okay, that's where I'm going to stop it. That's
bad.
Right, that's it for this week. From our panel, Claire Fox insisting on the last word, David Starkey, Ian Hargreaves, well, David Starkey had all the other words, Ian Hargreaves, David Cook, and from me. Until the same time next week, goodbye.
Moral Maze was presented by Michael Buerk and produced by David Coomes.